And who we're fighting, do we know who the enemy is? If I'm a soldier, and what is my experience in engaging with the enemy and knowing who that enemy is?
Okay, a lot of questions there. First, if you talk about your experiences as a soldier, and I just returned from southern Afghanistan where I was with U.S. and NATO soldiers, and they are fighting, and their enemy in the south is primarily the Taliban, and it's very clear who they're fighting. They're people, the Taliban are putting bombs in the roads, they're setting up ambushes, and the battle tempo in the south just starting to slow down a little bit as the winter is creeping in, but it is still fairly intense. The money question is a much murkier issue, and as was mentioned in several articles recently, the way security contractors have to operate here, they have to travel on the open roads. There are not many highways in this country, and in order to do that, they often have to pay middlemen. Sometimes those middlemen are directly affiliated with the Taliban. I've spoken to contractors who will have to pay these middlemen in order to securely move their goods. So the idea of operating as a legitimate business in this country is very difficult.
Yeah, I want to bring Matt Ho into the conversation, former State Department official who resigned the State Department over his opposition to the war. John Soltz, co-founder and chairman of VoteVets.org, served in the Iraq War, trained soldiers for both Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as serving in Kosovo. Also with us, military strategist Dan Gore, vice president of the Lexington Institute, a public policy research organization. He says whatever number of troops the president ends up sending, he should double it. Dan, I'll begin with you. How do you see this potential quagmire, and why is a troop escalation the right solution for you?
Because without security, without being able to address in a military sense, in a policing sense, a lot of these security issues, you're going to go nowhere. It's going to take time to root out corruption. It is going to take a real effort to teach Karzai and his people how to do business in a more normal way. It is going to take even longer to build even the semblance of an economy in Afghanistan. But if you don't have the security in order to have the space to do that, you've got nothing.
Yeah, I guess the argument or the concern has been, in an effort to achieve that aspect of nation building in Afghanistan, that is not a worthy use of our children or our tax dollars. In other words, if 8 years ago when we invaded Afghanistan, we wanted to prove to the Taliban that we were not going to let them harbor terrorist cells who would organize attacks against America, 8 years later, it seems we've proven the point. We are willing to go to war to protect our country, but have we now obliged ourselves to build a country that so many have tried to build and have not been able to do, going through the history of time, most recently in the 80s with Russia?
Well, Russia was less trying to build a country than prop up a government. And if that's what we're reduced to because of the problems with the Karzai government, then yeah, then it's too late and it's not worth doing it. But if what we're trying to do is leave something more stable behind, where whatever other political arguments are going to be among clans and tribes, there is not going to be the potential for a resurgence of the kind of Islamic fundamentalism that we saw 8 years ago, then that probably is a worthwhile end.
Yeah, Matt, when you hear that argument, and it's a sound argument, it makes sense, right? We send more people, or we can stabilize that environment. John, I'll come to you in 1 second. I'm hoping that I can get to Matt on this one. What is your response to that?
I think that the problem in Afghanistan is it's a 35-year-old civil war. And I disagree with the assessment on what the Soviets did. If we look at the Soviets in the course of their 9 years, which we're coming close to being there at the same time as the Soviets were, they had 100,000 troops there, but they also had 20,000 civilian advisors. The Soviets tried the same strategy we did of trying to prop up or stabilize or create a government that was unknown and unwanted by the people. The issue with counterinsurgency is you're supposed to separate the population from the insurgents. But in Afghanistan, how do you do that when the insurgents are the population? It's not a question of making the people believe in a central government. It's a question of understanding that it's a civil war, and that there are two sides of the civil war, and we're only backing one side. The answer to ending that civil war is political reconciliation, not more troops.
John Soltz, from the perspective of the organization that you run, what is the base level of stress on our military right now as the war extends and as stop-loss now sends soldiers 4 and 5 times back into the theater of war?
I think there's a real concern if counterinsurgency strategy across the board is something that can be sustained by the Department of the Army and the Marine Corps. If you take a look at the amount of troops that are in Afghanistan right now and add them to the amount of troops that are in Iraq, we're at surge levels where we were. So I don't even know where we're going to get the 40,000 troops from. It would put a tremendous amount of strain on the active component military. This is the first time we have not drastically increased the size of the Army during a time of war in the history of our country. It's all volunteer force, so it's a huge strain. And you're asking more of the military, the most proficient part of our federal government. And when I hear, these academic arguments from the other panelists, it gives me grave concern, because the one part of this mission we know will work is if you put those troops in the ground, they'll calm violence. But there's no guarantee at all that any of these other things that need to happen, like an interagency process in our government, will work, like the Pakistanis will play, like Karzai will become less corrupt. So why are we always asking sacrifice from the men and women who fight for our country 3 and 4 times when there's no guarantee this plan could ever work?
It strikes me, and this is my own opinion, I look at this, it's the smallest percentage of the U.S. population ever serving in the active military right now, and we call it an all-volunteer army, and yet we send the same soldier over an 8-year war in Afghanistan 4 or 5 times back into that theater of war, and it strikes me that that is a politically convenient policy to avoid having to institute a draft, let alone conversation of universal service. And as long as as long as the smallest percentage possible has to deal with the reality of shooting at people and being shot at, it's much easier for everybody, from the media to academics to politicians, to send more troops.
The hugest challenge that our soldiers face when they come home, and our Marines and anyone who's been in combat, is the disassociation they feel with their peer group. It's what leads to a lot of the PTSD. And so when you have this small percentage and you're 25 or you're 26 and you come home, how do you relate to basically the 99% of society that hasn't been there? This is the smallest percentage that's ever served in a war. There's 500,000 troops today basically in the Army. That's how many we had for 1 year in Vietnam. So we have incorporated the Guard and Reserve. They are involved as about 20% of every force package, or 30% to deploy, and that was supposed to be the circuit breaker to make sure the citizen soldier, is involved in the combat zone. But yeah, we have a huge disassociation between our warfighter and our civilians, and it makes it very difficult on the troops when they return home.
Matt, I got to wrap this up, but how do you make policy when the structure is set up to have both the politicians, the media, and everybody else in America as detached from the realities of being a soldier in the American Army as possible?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with John more. The stress on our troops, and, as a guy who's been there and everything else and has suffered some of the things he spoke about, it's a real concern. And this leads into a larger question for us as a nation. Besides the fact that, what are our priorities in Afghanistan? What are we really getting out of our young men and women dying over there? Are we making America safer? Is this really defeating al-Qaeda? It's not. But the larger philosophical question the president has to ask, and we as a nation have to ask, is, do we want our young men and women dying to support a corrupt and illegitimate kleptocracy like the Karzai government? It's a question we have to ask, because 5, 10, 15 years from now, how are we going to look at ourselves if we do support this corrupt and illegitimate regime? And
isn't it easier to do that if you have as much detachment as possible, as small a number of people serving, and you just keep recycling the individuals through that war? It's the easiest way to proceed, no?
Absolutely. I've gotten a lot of support from active duty military, and I just got an email just yesterday from a sergeant first class in the Army who's in Iraq, who's only got 2 years left before he retires, so he's got 18 years in. He said, it's become like the military has become like an abusive relationship. They tell you, i.e. the politicians, how much they love you, but they continue just to jerk you around and beat you up.
Yeah.
And I found that very striking, how simple he put that, but how accurate it is.
Yeah, and I think more and more of us are feeling and seeing more and more of that as we acquire more and more information. And I think that there's an obligation for the rest of us, most notably the media, because of the privilege of the voice we're given, to at the very least make all the facts known and force the politicians to own up to those facts when they make these decisions. Gentlemen, I thank all 3 of you for the conversation this morning. With the war in Afghanistan going 8 years, no end in sight, I think everyone will agree that our troops are getting the short end of the stick. We all know this. Many of the same service members deployed 5 or 6 times over a period of 8 years, with minuscule breaks in between, and compensation for many that is barely above the poverty line. Adding to this, the economy has been a boon for military recruitment as unemployment strips through our inner cities and our rural communities, which is where recruiting can be the most aggressive and most active. I wrote an article today for the Huffington Huffington Post talking about one small thing we could all do to help our fighting men and women, as opposed to pumping money into rescuing banks and the housing market as the banks use that money as a gambling chip. There is a way we could direct that same money to our troops for housing and as a tradable credit that would achieve the same effect, which would correct the price of all of our homes, which were mispriced by the credit bubble, and empower our troops who have been so severely abused by the American political body, let alone the money that has been given to the bankers for no apparent reason. Go to thehuffingtonpost.com, check it out, comment on it, let me know what you think about it. Again, I think we have an opportunity here to redirect some of the moral hazard money stolen from us by the bankers and reward some of the troops in this country who have been so severely neglected in that abusive relationship by our government, and for that matter, everybody who has not stepped forward to defend those troops from an abusive level of treatment in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Straight ahead here on The Morning Meeting.